Picture this. A grand ballroom, 500 of England's finest, candlelight catching the diamonds around every neck, and in the center of it all the Duke of Ashford, standing tall, radiant, utterly at ease. At his side, not his wife. Eleanor, the Duchess of Ashford, stands 3 feet away, alone, holding a glass of champagne she hasn't touched. She has been his wife for 11 years. She has run his household, raised his reputation, smiled at his guests, and swallowed her pride more times than she can count. And tonight, her husband turns to the room, raises his glass, and says the words that will echo through London society for the next decade. Allow me to introduce the woman who holds my heart, the true Duchess of Ashford. The woman on his arm smiles like she's won something. 500 people hold their breath. And Eleanor sets down her champagne glass, very carefully, very quietly. She smooths the front of her ivory gown. She turns to the woman her husband has just crowned above her, in front of everyone she has ever known. And she curtsies. Perfectly, gracefully, without a single tremor. Enchanted, she says. And then she walks out. Not quickly, not with tears streaming down her face, not with a dramatic speech or a slammed door. She simply leaves. And the ton never forgot it. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what no one knew that night. Eleanor wasn't walking away in defeat. She was walking toward something. And by the time Richard, Duke of Ashford, understood what that meant, it was far, far too late. Eleanor Ashford had learned, very early in her marriage, that perfection was a kind of armor. She had been 19 when she married Richard, young enough to believe in love, old enough to understand duty. The match had been considered exceptional. Richard was handsome, titled, and possessed of an easy charm that made every room feel warmer the moment he entered it. Her parents had wept with happiness. Her friends had whispered with envy. And Eleanor had walked down that aisle believing, truly believing, that she was the luckiest woman in England. That was 11 years ago. Now she rose each morning at 6:30. She met with the housekeeper at 7. She reviewed the household accounts by 8. She wrote correspondence, managed the tenant concerns, organized charitable contributions, planned dinner menus, and received callers, all before Richard had finished his breakfast. She did it without complaint, without drama, without asking for so much as a word of thanks. Because that was what a duchess did. Ashford Manor was magnificent, everyone said so. 43 rooms, a library that made grown men weep, gardens that had been written about in 3 separate publications. When guests arrived, they gasped. When they sat down to dine, they marveled. When they left, they told their friends. The Duchess of Ashford runs the finest house in the county. They were right, she did. What they did not say, what no one said, because no one quite knew how, was that the Duke of Ashford had very little to do with any of it. Richard was not cruel. Eleanor had told herself this so many times it had become something close to a prayer. He was not cruel. He was simply absent. Not always physically, though that too, but absent in the way that mattered more. He looked through her at dinner. He forgot what she had said by the following morning. He was delightful at parties and silent in private, warm to strangers and distant to the woman who had given him 11 years of her life. Eleanor had stopped asking where he went when he disappeared to London for weeks at a time. She had stopped asking a great many things. Instead, she perfected the flower arrangements in the east drawing room, the timing of the soup course, the angle of her smile when she greeted guests whose names she had already looked up, whose preferences she had already noted, whose comfort she had already arranged for, all before they stepped through the door. She was magnificent at it, truly, and she hated with a quiet and very private fury that magnificence had become her only consolation. It was on a Tuesday in October, a gray, unremarkable Tuesday, that she found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had simply gone into Richard's study to retrieve a household ledger he had borrowed and forgotten to return, as he forgot most things. The letter had slipped from between the pages of a book on the desk, fluttering to the floor at her feet. She should not have read it. She read it. It was not long. It did not need to be. The handwriting was feminine, fluid, entirely confident. The handwriting of a woman who had no doubt about her place in the world, or in the heart of the man she was writing to. Richard, I counted the hours. Come back to me soon, your V***. That was all. Eleanor stood in the study for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the gardener was doing something to the roses. A clock ticked on the mantelpiece. She folded the letter. She placed it back exactly where it had fallen. She picked up the ledger. And she walked out of the room. She did not cry. She had suspected, in the dim and carefully unexamined corners of her mind, for quite some time. Suspicion confirmed is not the same as surprise. It is something colder and more specific than surprise. It is the moment you understand that the life you have been building, every perfect dinner, every gracious smile, every swallowed word, has been built on sand. She went to her sitting room. She sat down at her desk, and she wrote a letter to her father's old solicitor, a man named Mr. Graves, whom she had not contacted in 3 years, and whom she trusted more than anyone alive. She asked him a single question. She sealed the letter. She rang for a footman. She sent it that afternoon. And then she went downstairs and hosted 6 guests for dinner with such warmth and elegance that 3 of them wrote to her afterward to say it had been the finest evening of the season. She had become very, very good at this. But something had changed. Something very quiet and very permanent. Eleanor Ashford had stopped building a life for Richard. She had started, without quite knowing it yet, building one for herself. The invitation had come from Lady Pemberton herself. That alone meant something. Cecily Pemberton was not a woman who issued invitations carelessly. Her autumn ball was the event by which the entire season was measured. To be invited was confirmation that you existed, socially speaking. To be excluded was a quiet but unmistakable death. Eleanor had attended every year for the past decade. This year the invitation had arrived addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ashford as always, but Richard had mentioned it first, which was unusual. Richard rarely mentioned social engagements in advance. He simply appeared, or he didn't. The Pemberton ball, he had said over breakfast, not looking up from his newspaper. Friday, we'll go together. Together? An odd word, Eleanor had thought. They attended things together frequently, in the sense that they arrived in the same carriage and occupied the same room. But together implied something more deliberate, something arranged. She had noted it, filed it away, said nothing. She wore ivory that evening. She always wore ivory. It had become her signature, the color the ton associated with her the way they associated certain words with certain people. Ivory, elegant, composed, the Duchess of Ashford. Her maid had dressed her hair with small pearl pins, and she had worn the Ashford diamonds, her right, her inheritance by marriage, cold and brilliant at her throat. She looked as she always looked, precisely as a duchess should. The Pemberton house was ablaze with light. Carriages lined the street 3 deep. Inside, 500 people moved and murmured and glittered, a vast organism of silk and ambition and carefully managed reputation. Eleanor moved through it the way she moved through everything, gracefully, unhurriedly, speaking to everyone, overlooking no one, remembering names and faces and small details that made people feel seen. Your mother is recovering well, I hope. Your son, he's at Oxford now, isn't he? What a remarkable season for your roses. I noticed them last time I passed. She was good at people. She had always been good at people. It was perhaps the one thing that required no performance, no armor. She was genuinely curious, genuinely warm, and people felt it. Richard was across the room. He had been across the room since they arrived. This, too, was not unusual. What was unusual was the woman beside him. Eleanor noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't belong, not dramatically, not with a thunderclap, but with a small, precise wrongness. Like a painting hung slightly crooked, like a word misspelled in an otherwise flawless letter. The woman was beautiful. Eleanor registered this the way she registered whether it was simply a fact. Dark hair, dark eyes, a gown of deep burgundy that had been chosen with great deliberate care. She was perhaps 26. She was laughing at something Richard had said, her hand resting on his arm with a familiarity that was not accidental. Your V***. Eleanor took a sip of champagne. Around her, the room continued its orchestrated hum. Lord Ashby was telling someone about his hunting prospects. Two young women near the window were pretending not to stare at the same gentleman. Lady Pemberton was moving through her guests like a ship in full sail, satisfied and magnificent. And then Richard moved. He moved to the center of the room deliberately, purposefully, in a way that drew the eye the way a raised voice draws the eye, not through sound but through intention. People noticed. People always noticed Richard. He had that quality, that gravitational pull, that Eleanor had once found so compelling and had since come to understand was simply a very effective social tool. He raised his glass. The room quieted. Not all at once, gradually, like a wave moving backward, the conversations dying away cluster by cluster, until there was nothing but the crackle of candles and the distant sound of the musicians, who had not yet been informed that they should stop. Then they stopped too. 500 people looked at the Duke of Ashford. He smiled. That smile, Eleanor knew that smile. She had watched it work on 100 rooms. Friends, he said. His voice carried beautifully. It always did. You have shown my family such extraordinary generosity over the years, and tonight I find I cannot in good conscience continue without honesty. A murmur, soft, uncertain. Eleanor did not move. She stood perhaps 15 feet away, a glass of champagne in her hand, her face arranged in an expression of polite attention. Her heart was beating very fast. She did not allow this to show. There are those among you who have known me long enough to know that I have not always been the pause, a self-deprecating tilt of the head, the man I ought to have been. But love, as they say, clarifies a man. It strips away pretense. It demands truth. The woman in burgundy had moved to his side. His hand found the small of her back. Allow me to introduce the woman who holds my heart, Richard said. Miss Vivienne Marchand, the true Duchess of Ashford. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. It was not a short silence. It expanded, filling every corner of the Pemberton ballroom, pressing against the gilded walls, rising to the painted ceiling. 500 people held 500 breaths. Eleanor felt it, the moment the entire room turned to look at her. Not at Richard, not at Vivienne. At her. Because that was the thing about a public humiliation of this particular kind. It required a witness. It required the humiliated party to be present, to be seen, to confirm by their reaction what had just been done to them. Richard had chosen to do this here tonight in front of everyone because he needed an audience. He needed the ton to see Eleanor reduced. She understood this. In the space of 3 seconds, standing in the candlelight with 500 pairs of eyes on her face, she understood it completely. And something happened inside of her. Something she had not expected. The fear dissolved. The humiliation, the hot, nauseating wave of it that had risen the moment she heard the words receded. pulled back like a tide, and what remained underneath was something much quieter, much cooler, and infinitely more dangerous. Clarity. She had been building her life on sand. She had known it since Tuesday, and now Richard had done her the extraordinary favor of setting fire to the sand in public so that there could be no more pretending. Very well. Eleanor Ashford set down her champagne glass on the tray of a passing footman. She smoothed the front of her ivory gown with one hand, a gesture so habitual it required no thought. She lifted her chin precisely 1 degree. And she walked toward them. The crowd parted. Of course it did. She was the Duchess of Ashford, and she moved like one. She stopped in front of Vivienne Marchand. The young woman's dark eyes met hers. There was triumph in them, barely concealed, bright and hungry. She had expected tears. She had expected a scene. She had expected Eleanor to crack, to crumble, to provide the spectacle that Richard had arranged this evening to produce. Eleanor looked at her for one long, unhurried moment. Then she curtsied. It was a perfect curtsy. The curtsy of a woman who had been performing them since childhood, who had curtsied to queens and countesses and foreign dignitaries, who could execute one in her sleep, deep enough to be respectful, unhurried enough to be absolutely deliberate. She rose. Enchanted, she said. Her voice did not shake. She held Vivienne's gaze for 1 beat longer. Then she turned, not to Richard. She did not look at Richard, and she walked toward the door. Not quickly, not slowly. At exactly the pace of a woman who has somewhere better to be. She collected her wrap from the footman in the entrance hall. She stepped out into the cool October night. The Ashford carriage was waiting. She had known it would be. She had always known where everything was. That was what she did, and she told the driver to take her home. She sat in the dark carriage alone, watching London pass outside the window. Her hands, folded in her lap, were perfectly still. Behind her, inside the Pemberton house, 500 people exhaled all at once. And then, because they were the ton and this was what the ton did, they began to talk. They would talk for weeks. They would talk for years. They would say many things about that evening. About Richard, about Vivienne, about the spectacular and catastrophic error of judgment that the Duke of Ashford had made in that ballroom. But what they would remember, what they would return to again and again in drawing rooms and parlors and morning calls across London, was not the scandal. It was Eleanor. The curtsy, the single word, the walk to the door. She didn't even look at him. That was what they would say. She didn't even look at him, she just left. And not one of them, not even the sharpest, most perceptive minds in the ton, had any idea what Eleanor Ashford was going to do next. But Mr. Graves, her father's old solicitor, was already waiting for her reply. The house was called Wren Cottage, which was a modest name for something that was not, strictly speaking, modest at all. It sat at the edge of a small village called Ashwick, 14 miles from Ashford Manor, on a plot of land that included a working kitchen garden, a small orchard, a stream that ran cold and clear even in August, and a view across the valley that on clear mornings made you believe, however briefly, that the world was essentially good. Eleanor's father had left it to her. Not to her husband, not to the Ashford estate. To her, Eleanor Margaret Hartwell, as she had been before she became a duchess, written into the will with a specificity that had clearly been intentional. Her father had been a quiet man, a careful man, a man who read situations the way other men read maps. He had liked Richard well enough at first. By the end, Eleanor suspected, he had understood more than he ever said. She had not visited Wren Cottage in 4 years. She arrived on a Saturday morning, 3 days after the Pemberton ball, with 2 trunks, her personal maid Agnes, and a leather satchel containing every document Mr. Graves had sent her over the past 72 hours. There had been, rather, a lot of them. The housekeeper, a stout, sensible woman named Mrs. Holt who had managed the cottage for years in Aline's absence, opened the door before the carriage had fully stopped. She looked at Aline. She looked at the trunks. She asked no questions. "I'll have the fires lit within the hour," she said, "and there's a good soup on." "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Aline said. "That will do very nicely." She walked inside. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender, and something underneath both of those things, something older and quieter, that Aline identified, after a moment, as peace. She had not smelled it in so long she had nearly forgotten what it was. She stood in the small entrance hall, her traveling coat still on, and breathed. Then she went to the desk in the sitting room, opened the leather satchel, and got to work. The letter she had written to Mr. Graves, the one sent from Ashford Manor on that quiet Tuesday after she had found the note, had asked a single question. What is mine? Not what did she deserve, not what could she claim, not what might Richard be persuaded to grant her in a moment of generosity or guilt. What was already, legally, irrevocably hers. Mr. Graves had replied with characteristic thoroughness. Wren Cottage and its lands, hers, unambiguously, by the terms of her father's will, structured in a way that placed it entirely outside the Ashford estate and beyond Richard's reach. Her mother's jewelry hers, a separate bequest clearly documented. A trust fund established by her maternal grandfather, dormant but intact, generating modest but steady income that had been accumulating for 11 years. Because Aline had never touched it, had not even known its current value, had forgotten it existed. She knew its value now. She read the figure Mr. Graves had written, and she read it again, and then she set the paper down and looked out the window at the orchard for a long moment. She was not a wealthy woman by the standards of the ton, but she was not, as she had half feared in the sleepless hours after the ball, a ruined one either. She was, in fact, something she had not been in 11 years. Independent. The word sat in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. She picked up her pen. The first visitor came on the 4th day. Lady Sophia Cavendish arrived in a carriage that was rather too fine for the narrow lane leading to the cottage, got stuck briefly in the gate, and emerged entirely unruffled in a shade of green that suited her enormously. She was Aline's oldest friend. They had come out the same season, had navigated the marriage mart together, had written to each other faithfully for 11 years across the distance that marriage and circumstance had placed between them. She walked through the cottage door, looked at Aline sitting at the desk surrounded by papers, and said, "Good God, you look better than you have in years." "Sit down, Sophia," Aline said. "Mrs. Holt will bring tea." "Everyone is talking," Sophia said, sitting. "In case you were wondering, which I suspect you weren't." "What are they saying?" "That Richard has lost his mind. That the Marchand woman is a disaster in Burgundy, that your Curtsied was the single most devastating social act witnessed in London in the last 20 years. Sophia accepted her tea from Mrs. Holt and looked at Aline steadily. "And that you are either very brave or very broken, and no one can quite determine which." "How do you find me?" Aline asked. Sophia studied her for a moment, the papers on the desk, the absence of red eyes, of crumpled handkerchiefs, of the particular hollowness that grief carves into a face. "Busy," she said finally. "You look busy." "I am," Aline said, "extraordinarily." She did not explain further. Sophia, who was wise as well as perceptive, did not press. But she came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And she was not the only one. They came, the women of the ton, with varying degrees of pretended casualness. Lady Ashby came to ask about Eleanor's kitchen garden and stayed 3 hours. Mrs. Fellows came under the guise of returning a book she had borrowed 18 months ago and left it, forgotten, on the hall table. Young Lady Priscilla Hurst, recently married and already quietly unhappy, came with no pretense at all and simply said at the door, "I didn't know where else to go." Eleanor brought her in and gave her tea and listened, and did not offer advice unless it was asked for, and when Priscilla left she looked, somehow, less fragile than when she had arrived. They all came, these women. Some from genuine affection, some from curiosity, some from a dim and unexamined instinct that something was happening at Wren Cottage that was worth being near. Eleanor received them all. She was warm and unhurried and asked the right questions, but she did not stop working. The papers on the desk multiplied. Mr. Graves visited twice in person, his old leather bag full of documents that he spread across the dining table, while Mrs. Holt brought biscuits and pretended not to listen. He explained to Eleanor, in his careful and methodical way, the precise architecture of the Ashford finances. It was, he said, with considerable understatement, not a healthy picture. How unhealthy? Eleanor asked. Mr. Graves looked at her over his spectacles. In 30 years of legal practice, he had delivered a great deal of difficult news to a great many people. He had never delivered it to anyone quite as composed as the woman sitting across from him. "The Duke," he said, "has been borrowing against the estate for approximately 6 years. The amounts are significant. The creditors are beginning to notice that the repayments are irregular. And Miss Marchand." A pause. Miss Marchand's circumstances prior to her association with the Duke were also irregular. There was a previous connection, some years ago, with a baronet in Derbyshire. He is no longer in possession of his family estate. Eleanor looked at the orchard through the window. "I see," she said. She picked up her pen. "Mr. Graves," she said, "I should like to understand everything, not the simplified version, everything." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his bag and produced another folder of papers, thicker than the first, and placed it on the table. "I was rather hoping you would say that," he said. It was on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after Eleanor had arrived at Wren Cottage, that she first encountered Lord William Cavendish. She had known of him vaguely, Sophia's husband's younger brother, widowed some years ago, something to do with land management and agricultural reform, quietly well regarded in the county. She had met him perhaps twice at large gatherings where he had made no particular impression, which she now understood said more about the gatherings than about him. He appeared at the edge of her orchard at 4:30, hat in hand, with an expression of mild embarrassment that Eleanor found immediately more interesting than most expressions she encountered. "Lady Ashford," he said, "forgive me. I'm your neighbor. My property borders yours along the eastern hedge. I've been meaning to call properly, but I didn't want to." He paused. "Intrude seems like an inadequate word." "Overwhelm," Eleanor suggested. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile but the precondition of one. "Yes, that." "You're not overwhelming me, Lord Cavendish. Would you like to see the orchard? I've been trying to determine whether these apple trees are salvageable, and I find myself unqualified to judge." He was, as it turned out, considerably qualified to judge. He knew about apple trees in the specific and detailed way that Eleanor was coming to understand was characteristic of him. He knew things properly, all the way down, without performance or exaggeration. They walked the orchard for 40 minutes. He told her which trees were worth keeping, which needed cutting back, which were simply too far gone. He did not tell her what to do about them. He told her what the options were, and what each would require, and then stopped and let her think. She found this extraordinarily refreshing. When he left, hat back on, apologizing again for the intrusion, Alina watched him walk back along the eastern hedge and thought that she could not remember the last time a conversation had left her feeling more rather than less like herself. She went back inside. On the desk, Mr. Graves's papers waited. She sat down, she picked up her pen. And from Ashford Manor, 14 miles away, a carriage was already being prepared. Richard had heard where she was. Richard was coming. Richard Ashford had never been good at waiting. It was, Alina had once thought, his most honest quality, the impatience that flickered behind the charm, the restlessness that no amount of social polish could entirely conceal. He wanted things when he wanted them. He moved toward what pleased him and away from what didn't, with the smooth and unthinking ease of a man who had never once been told that he couldn't. He arrived at Wren Cottage on a Thursday afternoon without sending word ahead. This was, Alina recognized, intentional. He had expected to find her unprepared, undone, perhaps, sitting in a darkened room somewhere, waiting to be retrieved. Instead, he found her in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, consulting with the gardener about the state of the herb beds, her hair pinned up with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested she had not spent a single moment of the past 3 weeks thinking about how she looked. She saw his carriage come up the lane. She finished her conversation with the gardener. Then she pulled down her sleeves, buttoned her cuffs, and walked to meet him. "Richard," she said. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has rearranged itself without his permission. "Alina, you look—" He stopped. "Well," she suggested pleasantly, "come inside, Mrs. Holt will bring tea." He sat in her small sitting room, Richard, who was accustomed to 43 rooms and 14-foot ceilings, and looked slightly displaced, like a piece of furniture from one house that doesn't quite fit in another. Alina sat across from him and poured tea with the steady hands of a woman who had made peace with something he had not yet begun to understand. "This is unnecessary," he said, the opener of a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and settled on authority as his primary register. "Whatever point you feel you've made, Alina, it's been made. Come home." "I am home," Alina said. A pause. "Ashford Manor is your home." "Wren Cottage belonged to my father," she said, "and now it belongs to me, so yes, I am home." Richard set down his teacup. He was not, she noted, entirely well. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there 3 weeks ago, and something slightly unsteady in the set of his jaw, the look of a man who had been sleeping badly and drinking rather more than was good for him. She noted this without satisfaction and without pity, with the clear and neutral attention she had been applying to everything lately. "The ton is talking," he said. "The ton is always talking. They're talking about us." "They're talking about you," Alina said, gently correcting him. "And about Miss Marchand. I rather think I've been cast in a sympathetic light from what I understand." His jaw tightened. "You made a scene." Alina looked at him for a long moment. "I curtsied," she said, "and left. I'm curious to know at which point during those 2 actions you feel a scene was made." He had no answer for this. She had known he wouldn't. He left 40 minutes later without having achieved anything he had come for. Alina watched the carriage go from the sitting room window. Then she turned back to her desk. She had not told him about Mr. Graves. She had not told him what she knew. Not yet. The picture that had assembled itself across her dining table, paper by paper, document by document, over the past 3 weeks, was considerably worse than even Mr. Graves had initially indicated. It was not merely that Richard had been borrowing against the estate. It was the nature of what he had borrowed for, and from whom, and on what terms, and, most critically, What had happened to the money once it left his hands? The timeline, as Mr. Graves had reconstructed it, was precise and damning. 6 years ago, Richard had made a series of investments, a shipping venture, a land development scheme in the north, something vaguely described as a continental trading enterprise, all of which had performed disastrously. The losses had been substantial. Rather than absorb them, reduce his expenditure, and rebuild quietly, which would have been unglamorous but survivable, Richard had borrowed to cover the losses, and then borrowed again to cover the interest on the first borrowing. And then, when that structure began to wobble, had borrowed from sources that a man of his position should never have approached at all. Private creditors, moneylenders operating in the margins of respectable society, men who were not impressed by titles and not patient about repayment schedules. Alina read the names in Mr. Graves's careful handwriting and felt a cold and specific horror that had nothing to do with her own situation. And then there was Vivienne. Miss Vivienne Marchand had arrived in Richard's life approximately 4 years ago. Precisely, and Alina did not think this was coincidental, at the point when his financial difficulties had become serious enough to require distraction from. Mr. Graves had been thorough about Vivienne as well. Her name had not always been Marchand. She had been born Vivienne Moore in Bristol, the daughter of a minor tradesman. She was intelligent, extraordinarily beautiful, and possessed of a talent for reinvention that Alina, in a different context, might have admired. She had moved through 3 different social circles in 10 years, each one a step higher than the last, leaving behind her a trail of men who had found their finances mysteriously depleted and their reputations mysteriously tarnished. The baronet in Derbyshire, whom Mr. Graves had mentioned, was the most recent and most complete example. Sir Edmund Price had met Vivienne 4 years ago, had been entirely captivated, had spent 3 years allowing himself to be separated from every financial and social advantage he possessed, and had ended the association, if one could call it an association when only one party understood what it actually was, without his estate, without his standing, and without any clear understanding of exactly how it had happened. Sir Edmund, Mr. Graves noted delicately, was not a stupid man. He was simply a man who had wanted very badly to believe something that was not true. Alina recognized this dynamic. She read the file on Vivienne Marchand twice, very carefully, and then she folded it and placed it in the leather satchel and sat for a while in the quiet of the sitting room while the fire crackled and the evening came down over the valley. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something sharper than this, vindication, perhaps, or righteous anger. What she felt instead was something closer to grief, for the 11 years, for the man Richard might have been and wasn't, for the waste of it all. She allowed herself 20 minutes of this. Then she opened the satchel and went back to work. It began to unravel publicly in November. These things always did eventually. The Ton had a way of finding the edges of a secret and pulling, not out of malice precisely, or not only out of malice, but because secrets were structurally unstable in a society built on information. They needed to be told. They needed to move. The first crack appeared at Lady Drummond's card party, where Vivienne arrived in a gown that was widely agreed to be extraordinary and was seated, as she had been increasingly seated since the Pemberton ball, in a position that suggested she expected to be treated as Richard's companion in every formal sense. Lady Drummond, who was 71 years old, had survived 3 kings, and did not trouble herself with diplomatic niceties when plain speaking was more efficient, looked at Vivienne across the card table and said, with the tone of a woman inquiring about the weather, "Miss Marchand, I wonder if you could settle a question for me. I've been trying to recall, wasn't there something some years ago in Derbyshire, concerning Sir Edmund Price?" The table went quiet. Vivienne smiled, I'm afraid I don't recall a Sir Edmund Price. No, Lady Drummond arranged her cards with great composure. How peculiar. He recalls you very well. It was a small thing. A question, a smile, a deflection. Nothing provable, nothing actionable. But the ton was a machine that ran on exactly this kind of fuel. And by the following morning the question had spread, modified, amplified, attached to other questions that had been quietly accumulating through every drawing room in London. Who is she really? Where does she come from? And what precisely happened to Sir Edmund Price? Richard heard the whispers. He heard them the way a man hears thunder, at first distant enough to be ignorable, then closer, then impossible to pretend away. He went to Vivienne with what he had heard, some version of it, and she was charming and reassuring and entirely plausible, and for approximately 4 days he believed her. Then the letter arrived from his primary creditor. It was not a long letter. It did not need to be. It informed him, in the clipped and businesslike language of a man who had extended considerably more patience than his terms required, that the outstanding balance on the Duke of Ashford's account had reached a figure that necessitated immediate discussion, and that if such discussion was not forthcoming within 30 days, the matter would be referred to his legal representatives. Richard read it 3 times. He poured himself a drink. He poured himself another. Then he went to Vivienne and told her about the letter, because he had no one else to tell, which was a condition he had not noticed descending upon him until it was already complete. Vivienne listened. She was sympathetic. She was warm. She took his hand and looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "Richard, darling, I know it feels overwhelming, but I've been thinking my friend Lord Harcastle has been asking to be introduced. He's enormously wealthy and he's expressed interest in certain investment opportunities. Perhaps if you were to facilitate an introduction." Richard looked at her. Something shifted. Something he could not quite name, a flicker at the corner of a truth he had been refusing to examine. "You want me to introduce you," he said slowly, "to a wealthy lord." Vivienne smiled. "I want us to solve our problems together, darling." Our asterisk problems. He thought about Sir Edmund Price. He thought about Eleanor, standing in the Pemberton ballroom with 500 people watching her face, setting down her champagne glass, and walking out with her chin raised and her hands perfectly steady. He thought about Eleanor in the cottage garden with her sleeves rolled up, looking at him as though he were a minor inconvenience she had already accounted for and moved past. He had a drink, he had several. And the next morning, he sent a note to Wren Cottage. It was not an apology. Richard Ashford was not yet capable of an apology. He was working toward it, slowly and painfully and without any clear map, the way a man works towards something he doesn't entirely want to reach, because reaching it means fully acknowledging what he has done. The note said, "Eleanor, I think we should talk properly this time." Oh. Eleanor read it at her desk. She set it down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote back in her clear and even hand, "Then come properly, Richard. Send word ahead. I'll have Mrs. Holt prepare lunch." He came the following Tuesday. And this time, before he arrived, Eleanor had put away every document on her desk. Not because she was hiding them, but because she already knew everything they contained, and she no longer needed to look at them to remember. She knew exactly what she held, and what he owed, and what was possible, and what was not. She knew, with a quietness that had taken 3 weeks of very hard work to arrive at, precisely who she was and what she intended. Lord William Cavendish, walking his eastern boundary that same morning, had seen the carriage come up the lane and stood at the hedge for a moment, watching. He had not gone to the cottage. It was not his place to go. But he had stayed at the hedge a little longer than usual before walking on. The valley was very still. The apple trees, the ones worth saving, stood bare and patient in the November light, waiting for what came next. Inside Wren Cottage, Eleanor put on the kettle. Richard was coming. And this time, she was ready for him. He looked older. Eleanor noticed this the moment Richard stepped through the door of Wren Cottage. Not older in the way that years make a man older, gradually and without drama, but older in the way that consequences do. Something had gone out of him. That particular brightness, that easy confidence that had once filled every room he entered, it was still there, but diminished, like a lamp turned down low. She noticed it, she did not remark on it. "Come in," she said. "Lunch is nearly ready." Mrs. Holt had prepared a simple meal, good soup, good bread, a cold roast with mustard, an apple tart from the orchard fruit that William had advised her to press before the first frost. Richard sat down at the small dining table and looked around the cottage with the expression of a man trying to understand something that resisted understanding. "You're comfortable here," he said. "Not a question. Something between observation and accusation." "Very," Eleanor said. "I didn't think you would be." She looked at him. "I know you didn't." They ate in silence for a moment. Outside, a robin was conducting urgent business in the kitchen garden. The fire was warm. The cottage was, in the way that Ashford Manor with its 43 rooms had never quite managed to be, genuinely comfortable, not impressive, not grand, but deeply and unapologetically itself. Richard set down his spoon. "I've made mistakes," he said. Eleanor waited. "With the estate, with certain decisions." He did not say Vivienne's name. Eleanor noticed this too. "I am not in a position to," he stopped, started again. "Things are more complicated than they ought to be." "Yes," Eleanor said, "I know." He looked up sharply. "What do you know?" "Enough," she said. "Mr. Graves is thorough." The color shifted in his face, a complicated movement, shame and anger arriving simultaneously and fighting for precedence. Shame won, narrowly. "You've been investigating me." "I've been understanding my own situation," Eleanor said with perfect evenness. "Which required understanding yours. I should have done it years ago. That's on me as much as anyone." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the robin had moved on. "I want you to come back," Richard said. There it was. Eleanor had known it was coming. She had known it since his note arrived, had known it before that, had known it the moment she walked out of the Pemberton ballroom and understood that Richard Ashford, for all his faults, had not accounted for the specific possibility of her absence. He had assumed she would be there, was always there in the way men assume oxygen is there. Constant, invisible, requiring no thought. She was not angry about this anymore. She had been briefly and intensely in the small hours of several nights at the cottage. But anger, she had found, was expensive. It cost too much to maintain and produced too little of value. She had spent it and moved on. "Why?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "Why do you want me to come back? I'd like to understand what you mean by it." Richard opened his mouth, closed it. This was not, evidently, the question he had prepared for. He had prepared for refusal, for tears, for bargaining, for the full repertoire of responses a wronged wife might produce. He had not prepared for a woman who simply wanted to understand his reasoning. "Because you're my wife," he said finally. "I am," Eleanor agreed. "And I have been for 11 years while you were otherwise occupied, so the fact of it doesn't seem sufficient on its own. What would be different?" Silence. "Richard," her voice was not unkind. She had worked hard to remove the unkindness from it, not for his sake but for her own, because she had discovered in the past weeks that clarity and bitterness could not comfortably occupy the same space, and she preferred clarity. "I'm not asking to wound you. I'm asking because it's a real question and I'd like a real answer." He looked at the table. at his hands, at something that wasn't quite visible. "I don't know," he said at last. And for the very first time, in 11 years of marriage, Alina heard something completely unguarded in his voice, something that had not been polished or rehearsed or aimed at any particular effect. It was almost enough to break her heart, almost. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she told him quietly. The offer, when it came, was practical rather than romantic. This was, Alina reflected, at least consistent. Richard had never been a romantic man, or rather, he had deployed romance strategically as a tool in the way he deployed charm. What he offered now was stripped of performance, because he had nothing left with which to perform. "Come back," he said. "Resume your place." The ton would accept it, they would accept anything Alina put her name to, that much had become clear. The creditors could be managed if the estate presented a stable face. The situation with Vivienne was resolving itself. He did not elaborate on this last point. Alina did not ask him to. In exchange, he searched for the word present. He would be present. Alina listened to all of it. She listened the way she had learned to listen in the past weeks, fully, without preparing her response while he spoke, without the half-attention of a woman who already knew what she thought. She gave him the courtesy of being genuinely heard. Then she was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. Not harshly, not with triumph, simply no. Richard stared at her. "I'm not coming back to Ashford Manor," Alina said. "Not on those terms, not on any terms that look like the last 11 years. I won't do it, Richard. Not because I want to punish you, I don't. Punishment is exhausting and I have better things to do with my time. But because going back to what we had would be," she considered the word carefully, "dishonest. And I find I can't do dishonesty anymore. I've used up my entire supply." "Then what?" His voice had an edge, not anger exactly, but the raw sound of a man who has run out of moves. "What do you want, Alina? Tell me and I'll—" "I don't want anything from you," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to strike him like something physical. "That's rather the point. I have what I need. I have this house and my father's trust and my own mind, which it turns out is quite a good one when given the chance to operate freely. I don't need you to give me anything. I need you to understand that." Richard sat across from her and looked, for the first time she could remember, genuinely lost. She felt for him then. Not love, not the love she had arrived at marriage with, which had been real enough in its way and deserved better than what it received, but something human and unavoidable. He was a man who had built himself entirely on surfaces, and the surfaces were gone, and underneath was someone who had never learned what to do without them. "What happens to us?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Alina said honestly. "But whatever it is, it will be the truth. That's more than we've had in a very long time." He was in the lane, waiting for his carriage to be brought round, when Lord William Cavendish appeared at the eastern gate. It was entirely accidental. Or it appeared entirely accidental. William had the gift, Alina had noticed, of appearing exactly where he was without apology or explanation, as though his presence required neither justification nor announcement. He had been checking his fence line, which was a legitimate activity. He had not known, or had chosen not to know, whether Richard's carriage would still be there. The two men looked at each other across the lane. They had known each other for years, had moved in overlapping circles, had hunted on adjacent land, had sat at the same tables at the same dinners. They were not enemies. They were not friends. They were two men who had always understood each other's measure and found the measurement, in each case, instructive. "Cavendish," Richard said. "Ashford," William's voice was neutral, not cold, not warm, precisely calibrated. A pause. The carriage was not yet visible. "Your neighbors," Richard said. He said it in the tone of a man discovering something he should have known sooner. "Along the eastern hedge," William said. Your wife's apple trees are in better shape than they were. Good soil there." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the cottage, where Eleanor had returned to the sitting room window, not watching exactly, but present in the way she was always present, aware of everything, missing nothing. And Richard Ashford, Duke of Ashford, educated at Eton and Oxford, possessed of a title 400 years old, charming and handsome, and accomplished in every way that his world valued, felt, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely afraid of what he had lost. Not the wife, not even the marriage. The woman. The specific, particular, irreplaceable woman who had been standing right in front of him for 11 years, while he looked through her at things that were so much smaller and less worth looking at. His carriage came round the bend. He got in without another word. William watched it go. Then he walked to the cottage door and knocked. Eleanor opened it. "I saw," she said. "Come in, there's apple tart." He came in. They sat in the small sitting room with the fire and the tart and the quiet that had developed between them over the past weeks. A quiet that was not empty but full, the way the best silences are full, not with things unsaid, but with things that don't require saying. "He's going to fight this," William said eventually. Not a prediction, an observation offered without alarm. "I know," Eleanor said. "Are you all right?" She considered the question properly, the way she had learned to consider things. Not the reflexive asterisk, yes, quite, thank you asterisk of 11 years of performed composure, but the real answer found by actually looking. "Yes," she said, "I rather think I am." William looked at her. In the firelight, with the tart half-eaten between them and Mr. Graves's leather satchel on the desk, and the apple trees standing bare in the last of the evening light, he looked at her in a way that was entirely different from the way anyone had looked at her in a very long time. Not at the Duchess, not at the surface, at Eleanor. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "Richard and I were friends once, before you married, quite good friends." He was quiet for a moment. "I was there the season you came out. I saw you at 3 different events before he did. I thought," he stopped. "What did you think?" Eleanor asked. "I thought you were the most interesting person in the room," he said simply. "Every room. I thought it every time, and then he saw you and I stepped back. Because that was the kind of man I thought he was at the time." A pause. "I was wrong about that." Eleanor looked at the fire for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I've been your neighbor for 3 weeks," William said, "and your friend for 2, and I find I'm running out of patience with not being honest." He met her eyes. "I'm not telling you to do anything with it. I just wanted you to know that someone saw you before all of this. Someone noticed." The fire crackled. Outside, the valley was going dark, the last of the light pulling back from the hills in long violet streaks. Eleanor felt something move in her chest, not dramatic, not the thunderclap of a romance novel, but something quieter and more durable than that. Something that had been very still for a very long time, carefully conserved, waiting without knowing it was waiting. "William," she said. "Yes." "Ask me to dinner, properly, next week." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, that precondition of a smile, arriving at last into the full thing. It was a very good smile, she thought. She had suspected it would be. "Lady Ashford," he said, "would you do me the honor of dining with me next Tuesday?" "I would," she said. "Thank you for asking." And in the lane outside, Richard's carriage was already halfway to London, carrying a man who was only beginning to understand the full cost of everything he had thrown away. Vivienne Marchand made her final mistake on a Thursday. This was, in retrospect, entirely in character. Vivienne operated on instinct, sharp, quick, predatory instinct that had served her extraordinarily well for a very long time. The problem with instinct, as opposed to judgment, is that it does not slow down when slowing down is what the situation requires. It simply continues, full speed, in the direction it has always gone. And Vivienne had always gone toward the next thing. The next thing in November of that year was Lord Hardcastle. Edmund Hardcastle was 63, recently widowed, and in possession of a fortune so substantial that even the most conservative estimates of it produced a pleasant dizziness in those who thought about it too carefully. He had arrived in London for the winter season in the way that wealthy and recently bereaved men sometimes arrive in London, not quite knowing what he was looking for, but aware that he was looking for something, and susceptible, in that particular condition of grief and loneliness, to being found. Vivienne found him at Lady Ashby's musicale on a Thursday evening in November, 3 weeks after her conversation with Richard about the introduction. Richard had not facilitated it. Richard, in the end, had not done much of anything, had retreated into a fog of whiskey and uncharacteristic silence that Vivienne had initially interpreted as a temporary condition, and was beginning to suspect was something more permanent and inconvenient. No matter, she had never needed a door opened for her. She was perfectly capable of opening doors herself. She was magnificent that evening. She knew it, she could feel it, the way an athlete feels when everything is working perfectly, every movement precise and effective and apparently effortless. She found Hardcastle in the third room, recognized him immediately from the description she had obtained through channels she found useful, and positioned herself within his orbit with the casual expertise of long practice. Within 20 minutes, they were in conversation. Within 40, he was laughing. Within the hour, he had asked if she would be attending Lady Drummond's dinner the following week, in the tone of a man hoping very much that the answer would be yes. What Vivienne did not know, could not have known, because she had not been paying sufficient attention to the currents moving through the ton in the past weeks, too occupied with the deteriorating situation at Ashford Manor to track the social weather with her usual precision, was that Lord Hardcastle was Lady Drummond's nephew. And Lady Drummond had been paying very close attention indeed. Lady Cecily Drummond was, as previously noted, 71 years old and had survived 3 kings. She had also, in the course of those 71 years, developed a comprehensive and finely calibrated understanding of human nature in general and social predation in particular. She had seen women like Vivienne before, not often, but enough. She recognized the type the way an experienced gardener recognizes a particular weed, not with alarm, but with the calm and practical intention of removing it before it spreads. She had been gathering information for 6 weeks. She had written to acquaintances in Bristol. She had written to a friend whose husband moved in the financial circles where Sir Edmund Price had once been prominent. She had had 2 very interesting conversations with Mr. Graves, not about Aline's affairs, which were not her business, but about certain other matters, which were. She had, in short, done what Aline had done, but from a different angle and with the resources of 71 years of social leverage behind her. She was ready. Lord Hardcastle mentioned Vivienne Marchand to his aunt on Friday morning, over breakfast, with the shy enthusiasm of a man who has met someone interesting and wants to share it with someone he trusts. Lady Drummond listened. She poured more tea. She set down the pot with great care. Then she told her nephew, in precise and measured terms, exactly what she had learned about Miss Vivienne Marchand, formerly known as Vivienne Moore of Bristol, in the past 6 weeks. She did not sensationalize. She did not embellish. She simply told him the facts in order, with the documentary evidence she had assembled placed on the breakfast table between them. Lord Hardcastle, who was 63 but not stupid, read every page. He did not attend Lady Drummond's dinner the following week. He did not send a note to Vivienne explaining his absence. He simply disappeared from her horizon, the way wealthy men disappear when they have been warned in time, cleanly and without drama. Vivienne noticed his absence. She inquired through intermediaries and received no satisfactory answer. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something unfamiliar. She felt the ground shift. It happened publicly on a Wednesday. These things, as Alina had observed, always did. It was a small gathering, by ton standards, intimate, at the home of Lord and Lady Fenton, who occupied a position in London society precisely central enough that what happened in their drawing room on a Wednesday evening would be thoroughly disseminated by Thursday morning. Vivienne arrived. She had been arriving at these gatherings with increasing confidence over the past months, since the Pemberton ball, since Richard's announcement had seemed to clear a path for her, to establish her place in a world she had been working toward for years. She had not noticed that the path had been quietly closing behind her. She noticed now. She was not excluded. It was nothing so legible as exclusion. It was subtler than that. The tongue worked in subtleties, in the slight coolness of a greeting, the microseconds hesitation before a smile, the way a conversation seemed to conclude naturally just as she approached. It was the technique of a society that had been managing its own membership for centuries and had developed the art of freezing someone out to a precision that left no visible marks. She moved through the room and felt it, the temperature dropping, degree by degree as she passed. Lady Drummond was there. Vivienne had known she would be. She had prepared for it, had told herself that the old woman's questions at the card party had been nothing, had been managed, had left no lasting impression. But Lady Drummond was talking to Lord Fenwick, and as Vivienne passed she heard, clearly, calmly, in the carrying voice of a woman who knew exactly how far her words would travel, the words Bristol and Price, an asterisk extraordinary coincidence, wouldn't you say? Vivienne stopped. Lady Drummond looked at her. It was a look of complete and unhurried composure, not hostile, not triumphant, simply clear, the look of a woman who knows exactly what she knows and intends to go on knowing it, publicly and without apology, for as long as necessary. Vivienne understood in that moment, with the instinctive clarity that had always been her greatest asset, that she had lost this particular game. The question was only what form the losing would take. She chose, to her credit, a dignified exit. She did not make a scene. She did not confront Lady Drummond or attempt a public denial or do any of the things that would have made it worse. She collected her wrap with composure, cited a headache to her hostess, and left. Outside in the carriage alone, she sat in the dark for a long time. Then she made calculations. Vivienne Marchand was, above all things, a practical woman. She came to Richard on Thursday morning. He had not been expecting her. He was in the study at his London house, staring at a letter from his solicitor with the expression of a man reading his own sentence, when she was announced. He looked up. Something moved across his face, relief, habit, the memory of warmth, before something more recent and more complicated settled over it. Vivienne. She sat down across from him. She was beautifully dressed, as always. She did not waste beauty, not even now. But something had changed in her face. The performance was still there, but it was running on reduced fuel, and he could see, for the first time, the machinery beneath it. He wondered how long it had been visible, and he had simply chosen not to look. "I'm going to Paris," she said. Richard stared at her. "There are people there I know," she continued. "Opportunities that are better suited to my current situation." She paused. Something crossed her face that might, in different circumstances, have been regret. "I think we both know this has run its course." "You're leaving," he said flatly, without inflection. "I'm being sensible," she said, "which is more than you've been, darling, if we're being honest." And then, because she was who she was and could not quite resist it even now, "You should have managed your finances better. I can't work with nothing." Richard looked at her for a long moment. He thought of Eleanor, sitting across from him at the small table in the cottage, asking him in that clear and steady voice why he wanted her back. What would be different? What he actually meant by it, treating his answers as though they mattered, as though he were someone worth the effort of real questions. He thought of the contrast. "Goodbye, Vivienne," he said. She left. And Richard Ashford, Duke of Ashford, sat alone in his study with the solicitor's letter and the silence and the full, unobstructed, merciless view of the past 4 years. What he had allowed, what he had chosen, what he had destroyed, and for the first time permitted himself to see it completely. It was not a comfortable thing to see. He poured a drink. He set it down without touching it. He picked up a piece of paper. He wrote for a long time. The letter arrived at Wren Cottage on a Saturday morning. Eleanor was at the desk. She was always at the desk now, though the work had changed in character. Less defensive, more constructive, the difference between building a wall and building a house, when Agnes brought it in on a small tray with the Morning Post. She recognized Richard's handwriting. She set aside what she was reading and opened it. It was long, 3 pages in Richard's hand, which was usually precise and controlled but which ran, in places, slightly uneven, the writing of a man who had been pressing hard on the pen. He did not make excuses. This surprised her enough that she stopped and read the passage twice to confirm it. He did not explain or justify or contextualize. He simply described what he had done, what he had known and chosen not to examine, what he had taken for granted for years in ways that he laid out with a specificity that suggested he had been making himself look at it fully, without flinching, for some time before putting pen to paper. He said he was sorry. He said it was insufficient. He said he knew it was insufficient and was saying it anyway, because she deserved to hear it even if it changed nothing, and he was finished prioritizing his own comfort over what she deserved. He said, and this was the line that Eleanor read 3 times, sitting at her desk in the cottage with the Saturday morning light coming through the window and the fire going quietly and the apple trees bare in the garden. "I think I have loved you for a long time without knowing what love actually required of me. I know now. It required everything I withheld. I'm sorry I learned it too late." Eleanor set the letter down. She sat for a while. She did not cry. She had thought she might when this moment came, had anticipated it, had felt the potential of tears, had been prepared for them. But what arrived was not tears. It was something quieter, something like the final click of a door closing, not slammed, not locked, but simply shut, gently and completely, on a room she had lived in for 11 years and was now, at last, leaving properly. She folded the letter. She placed it in the drawer of her desk. She did not write back, not that day. The document arrived on Monday. It came from Mr. Graves, as everything useful came from Mr. Graves, with a cover letter that was 2 sentences long and characteristically precise. "The attached represents the instrument you requested some weeks ago. Circumstances have now aligned to make execution possible. I await your instructions." Eleanor set it on the desk. It was a formal separation agreement, not a divorce, which remained practically impossible, but something that achieved most of the same things through different means. Separate maintenance, separate residence, full control of her own finances and property, no requirement of cohabitation or public association beyond the minimum demanded by their legal status. Freedom in every sense that practically mattered. All it required was her signature. She sat at the desk for a long time. Outside, she could hear William in the orchard. He had come that morning to look at the drainage along the eastern boundary, which had been causing problems, and had stayed, as he often stayed now, moving quietly through the property doing useful things and asking nothing in return. She could hear the occasional sound of him, a footstep, a brief exchange with the gardener, and the sound was ordinary and steady, and entirely unlike anything she had previously understood home to feel like. She picked up the pen. She looked at the document. She looked at it for a long time. And then she put the pen down, stood up, and walked to the window. "William," she called. He appeared from behind the far apple tree, looking up, patient, present. "Come inside," she said. "I need to think out loud, and Mrs. Holt has made gingerbread." He came inside. She did not sign the document that day, nor the next. What she did instead was think, carefully, thoroughly, without hurry, the way she had learned to do everything in the past weeks, not from fear, not from hope, simply from the conviction that a decision of this weight deserved to be made with full deliberation, in full possession of herself, by a woman who understood exactly what she was choosing and why. She was very nearly there. She needed one more thing. And the Tun's winter season was about to provide it. The invitation came from Lady Pemberton. Of course it did. Cecily Pemberton was not a woman who left narratives unfinished. She had hosted the evening on which the Duke of Ashford had publicly humiliated his wife in front of 500 witnesses, and she felt, not guilt precisely, she was too pragmatic for guilt, but a certain proprietorial responsibility for how the story concluded. She had watched Elinor walk out of her ballroom that October night with her chin raised and her hands steady, and she had thought, in the moment before the room erupted into noise, that woman is going to be extraordinary. She had been right. She was usually right. The winter ball was the season's closing event, as significant as her autumn gathering, differently weighted. Where the autumn ball opened the social calendar with possibility, the winter ball closed it with verdict. Reputations made or cemented, positions confirmed or quietly revised. The Tun assembled one final time to take stock of who everyone was and where everyone stood before retreating to their country houses for Christmas. It was, in short, the precise occasion on which Elinor's reappearance would mean the most. The invitation was addressed to Lady Elinor Ashford. Not the Duchess, not the Duke and Duchess, Elinor alone in her own right, her own name. Lady Pemberton had very good handwriting, and used it with great intentionality. Elinor read the invitation at her desk on a Tuesday morning, set it down, and looked out at the orchard for a moment. The apple trees were still bare, but there was something in them now, a tension, a readiness, that suggested they knew something was coming. William had told her the previous week that the ones along the eastern wall would bloom first in spring. She was looking forward to seeing it. She picked up her pen and wrote her acceptance. She told William that evening. They had fallen into a habit, dinner at the cottage twice a week, sometimes 3 times, sometimes more depending on the demands of his property and the particular projects consuming Elinor's desk. It had the quality of something that had always existed, that had simply been waiting to be noticed, like a path through a garden that turns out to have been there all along beneath the overgrowth. "The Pemberton winter ball," she said, "in 3 weeks." William was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass in his hand. "Are you ready for it?" "I think so," she considered. "I'm not afraid of them, that's new. I was afraid of them for 11 years, of their opinions, their assessments, their verdict on whether I was sufficient. I'm not anymore. I'm not sure exactly when it changed." "I can tell you approximately when," William said. "It was somewhere between the 3rd Tuesday and the discovery that your apple trees were salvageable." Elinor laughed. She had been laughing more lately, genuinely, not the social laugh she had deployed for years, the one that confirmed other people's wit without committing to any particular feeling. This was different. It came from somewhere unguarded. "Will you come?" she asked. He looked at her across the small table, in the firelight, with the steady directness that she had come to understand was simply his nature. Not a performance of honesty, but the real thing, consistent all the way through. "I'll come," he said, "if that's what you'd like." "It's what I'd like," she said. "But William, I want to be clear about something. I'm not going to the Pemberton ball with you as a statement. I'm not going to make Richard jealous or make the ton talk or demonstrate anything to anyone." She paused. "I'm going because I want to be there. And I want you there because," she chose the words carefully, "because you make things better. Not easier necessarily. Better. There's a difference." William was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. I have something to ask you." She waited. He set down his wine glass. He was not a man who made dramatic gestures or arranged scenes. She had understood this about him early and had found it, compared to a decade of Richard's carefully orchestrated performances, profoundly restful. What he did instead was simply say what he meant, directly and without preamble. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with full knowledge of your situation and mine and without any expectation of speed or resolution. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I'm asking for the chance to continue being exactly this, a gesture between them, taking in the table and the fire and the gingerbread and the comfortable evening, but with intention, with honesty about what it is." Eleanor looked at him. Outside, the valley was dark and still, the hills black against a sky full of stars. Inside, the fire was warm. The cottage was quiet in its particular way, not the silence of absence but the silence of sufficiency, of enough. She thought about Richard's letter, still in the drawer of her desk. "I think I have loved you for a long time without knowing what love required of me." She thought about what it had cost him to write that, and what it meant, and what it was too late to change. She thought about the document from Mr. Graves, still unsigned. She thought about spring, and the apple trees along the eastern wall that would bloom first. "Yes," she said, "on those terms, yes." Something shifted in William's face. That smile, the full one, the real one, arrived and stayed. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for asking properly," she said. "It matters. People don't always understand how much it matters." She signed the document the next morning. Not in a dramatic moment, not with ceremony or audience. She sat down at her desk after breakfast, read every page one final time with the attention it deserved, picked up her pen, and signed her name in the clear and unhurried hand of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. Eleanor Margaret Hartwell, as she had been, as she still was underneath everything else. She sealed it and sent it to Mr. Graves with a brief covering note. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went out to the orchard. It was a cold morning, sharp-haired and bright, the kind of winter morning that makes everything look new-edged and particular. She walked the rows of apple trees slowly, touching the bark of the ones she had learned to recognize. The one William had said would need cutting back, the one near the eastern wall that would bloom first, the old gnarled one in the corner that looked, against all expectation, entirely worth saving. She stood in the middle of the orchard for a while, doing nothing except being there. Then she went inside and got back to work. She did not hear from Richard directly, after Mr. Graves sent notification of the signed agreement. What she heard through Sophia, who remained her most reliable correspondent in all matters social and otherwise, was that Richard had received it quietly, had signed his own portion without contest, and had subsequently done something that surprised nearly everyone who knew him. He had dismissed his London solicitors, engaged a new firm, and begun the slow and apparently genuine work of addressing his financial situation through means that involved actual economy rather than further borrowing. He had sold the hunting lodge in Scotland. He had reduced the London house staff by half. He had, Sophia reported with barely concealed astonishment, been seen at his desk at 9 in the morning on 3 consecutive occasions, working. "He looks terrible," Sophia said, when she visited the cottage a week before the Pemberton ball. "I mean that kindly. He looks like a man who has stopped pretending, which is always alarming to witness but generally a good sign for the long term." "He'll be all right," Elinor said, and she meant it not as consolation, not as performance of generosity, but as genuine assessment. Richard was not a bad man. He had been a careless one, a selfish one, a man so accustomed to the world arranging itself around his comfort that he had never developed the muscles required to arrange himself around anyone else's. But muscles could be built if the will was there. Whether the will was there, she no longer needed to know. "And you," Sophia said, in the particular tone she used when she was asking the real question beneath the surface question. Elinor thought about it properly. "I have a cottage," she said, "that smells of wood smoke and lavender. I have apple trees that will bloom in spring. I have Mr. Graves, who is the most useful man I have ever known, and Mrs. Holt, who makes gingerbread that I am fairly certain is supernatural in origin. I have you." A pause. "And I have William Cavendish, who asks real questions and listens to the answers and knows the difference between the trees worth saving and the ones that are too far gone." Sophia looked at her for a long moment. "You're happy," she said. Not a question. A kind of wondering recognition, the expression of a woman watching something she had hoped for arrive. "I'm better than happy," Elinor said. "I'm myself. It turns out they're not the same thing at all." The night of the Pemberton Winter Ball was clear and cold, the sky above London enormous and starlit, the kind of night that makes a city feel briefly like it might be worth all the trouble it causes. Elinor arrived alone. She had discussed this with William and they had agreed she would arrive alone, make her entrance on her own terms, and he would follow shortly after. It was important. They both understood without much discussion that she walk into that room by herself. Not to prove anything. Simply because it was true she was herself, standing on her own ground, and that should be visible from the start. She wore deep blue. Not ivory. Ivory had been her armor, her signature, the color of a woman trying to appear untouchable. Blue was something different, warmer, more deliberate, the color of a choice rather than a defense. Her maid had dressed her hair simply, and she wore her mother's sapphires, which she had not worn in years, which were hers and had always been hers and looked, she thought, exactly right. She stood in the entrance of the Pemberton ballroom and paused for one breath. The room was full, 500 people, the same 500, the same candlelight and diamonds and orchestrated hum of a society performing itself. She had stood in this room 100 times. She had never stood in it like this. She walked in. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden silence, no orchestrated moment. It happened gradually, the way it had at the card party, the way things moved through a room, a recognition spreading outward from where she walked, a turning of heads, a shifting of attention. And then something she had not expected. Lady Drummond, seated in her customary chair near the fireplace, looked up as Elinor passed. She raised her glass. A single, deliberate gesture, unhurried and entirely public. Elinor inclined her head. From across the room, Lady Ashby started toward her. Then Mrs. Fellows. Then Priscilla Hurst, the young woman who had arrived at the cottage door saying she didn't know where else to go, and who had come back twice since, and who was standing now with her chin slightly higher than it had been in October. They came to her, these women. Not all at once, not in a rush, but steadily gravitating, the way people gravitate toward something they recognize as real. Elinor moved through the room and they found her, and she spoke to each of them with the full attention she gave to everything now, asking about their mothers and their sons at Oxford and their roses, and meaning every word. She did not look for Richard. She did not need to. He was there. He was standing near the far wall with Lord Fenwick, looking considerably less polished than he had ever looked in this room before, and considerably more present. He saw her the moment she entered. She understood this without looking directly at him, with the peripheral awareness she had always had of where he was in any given room, which she suspected would take years to lose entirely. She did not avoid him. She did not seek him out. She simply moved through the room being herself, and at some point, midway through the evening, when the dancing had begun and the candles had burned lower, she found herself near him, and it seemed more awkward to reroute than to simply acknowledge it. "Elinor," he said. "Richard," she stopped, looked at him properly. He looked at her with an expression she had no category for. It had too many things in it, things she suspected he was still learning to let his face show. He did not try to simplify it. "You look," he said, and then he stopped, and something honest moved across his face. "You look like yourself," he said. "I'm not sure I had seen that before, not properly." Elinor considered this. "No," she said gently, "I don't think you had." A pause. Around them the room moved and glittered. The orchestra played something bright and irrelevant. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said. "I'm glad they can see you, the way you—" He stopped again. "You deserved this all along, the room turning toward you. You always deserved it." Elinor looked at him for a moment. "Take care of yourself, Richard," she said. And she meant it plainly, without subtext, without bitterness. She meant it the way you mean it when you say it to someone you once loved and have released, and wish well from the appropriate distance. He nodded. Something in him seemed to settle, the almost imperceptible drop of a weight being set down. "Good night, Elinor," he said. "Good night." She moved on. William arrived at 9:30. She saw him from across the room, unhurried, as always, moving through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his own mind and requires no audience for it. He found her without searching, which she had begun to understand was simply how it was with them. They found each other easily, as though there were something navigational about it. He stopped beside her. "How is it?" he said quietly. "It's fine," she said. "Better than fine. William," she looked at him, "would you like to dance?" He offered his hand. She took it. They moved onto the floor, and the music shifted to something slower and more deliberate. And Elinor Ashford danced in the Pemberton ballroom with a man who had seen her, truly seen her, across a crowded room, years ago, and had been honest enough to say so when it finally mattered. She was not performing. She was not managing or composing or maintaining. She was simply there, present in her own body, in her own life, on her own terms. Across the room, from his position near the far wall, Richard watched. He watched with the expression of a man who has understood something too late and has decided, in the particular way that understanding too late sometimes produces, to let the understanding be enough, to carry it forward rather than collapse under it, to become, slowly and without audience, the person who deserved better than he had been. It was not a glamorous kind of change. It was the hard, quiet, unglamorous kind. But it was real. And Elinor, dancing in blue in the candlelight with her mother's sapphires and her father's cottage and her own name, Elinor did not see his expression because she was not looking at him. She was looking at William. And she was smiling. Not the composed smile, not the Duchess smile, the social smile, the carefully calibrated expression of a woman managing a room. The real one. It was, everyone who saw it would later agree, quite something. Lady Pemberton, watching from her customary vantage point near the entrance, observed the room with the satisfaction of a woman who has arranged things well. She had not, strictly speaking, arranged any of this. But she had created the conditions. She had sent the invitation worded precisely as it was worded. She had ensured Lady Drummond was seated where she was seated. She had selected the orchestra, and the orchestra had, serendipitously, chosen to play what they were playing at exactly the right moment. She raised her glass of champagne. To no one in particular. To the room, perhaps. To the evening. To the particular and irreplaceable satisfaction of watching a woman who had been underestimated by everyone, including herself, discover the full extent of what she was capable of. The ton never forgot it, they would say, for years afterward. They would mean the curtsy at the Pemberton Autumn Ball, the single word, the walk to the door. But those who were there on the winter night, those who saw her walk in alone, and move through the room like something finally free, and dance in blue in the candlelight with William Cavendish, while Richard Ashford watched from across the room and understood at last what he had lost. Those people knew the real ending was here. And it was magnificent. The school had no grand name. Elinor had considered giving it one, something classical, something that would look well on a brass plate by the door, and had decided against it. Names like that were for institutions that needed to impress people. This one didn't need to impress anyone. It needed to teach 12 girls between the ages of 7 and 14 how to read, how to write, how to think, and how to understand that the world was considerably larger than anyone had yet told them it was. It sat at the edge of the Wren Cottage property, in what had previously been a disused storage building that William had spent the better part of a spring converting, quietly, methodically, without being asked twice, into something with good light and a sound roof, and a fireplace that actually drew properly. Elinor had furnished it herself, desks from a carpenter in the village, books from her own shelves, supplemented by donations from Sophia, from Lady Drummond, from Priscilla Hurst, who had turned out, once given the proper conditions, to be a woman of considerable resource and determination. A globe, slightly outdated, that William had found at an estate sale and carried home in the back of his cart, with the careful satisfaction of a man delivering something he knows will be well used. The teacher was a young woman named Miss Clara Abbott, 24 years old, the daughter of a local clergyman, possessed of a mind like a freshly sharpened pencil, and the patience of someone who genuinely liked children rather than merely tolerating them. Elinor had found her through Mr. Graves, who had found her through a network of connections that Elinor was increasingly convinced was supernatural in scope. Mr. Graves denied this with characteristic composure and continued to be supernaturally useful. On Tuesday and Thursday mornings, Elinor taught the class herself. She taught them history, not the history of kings and battles which they could find in any book, but the history of women who had done things, made things, changed things, often without anyone writing it down. She told the stories the way you tell stories when you know they matter, not as lessons, not as improving examples, but as true accounts of real people who had been alive and thinking, and finding their way through a world that did not always make it easy. The girls listened with the particular quality of attention that children produce when they understand, instinctively, that what they are hearing is actually meant for them. Elinor loved those mornings with a specificity and completeness that surprised her every time. Wren Cottage had expanded slightly. Not dramatically, Elinor had resisted the instinct to improve, which she recognized as a remnant of 11 years of Ashford Manor, of always needing things to be more larger, more impressive. The cottage was what it was. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. But the study was larger now, with better shelves, and the kitchen garden had been properly reorganized so that it actually produced what it was supposed to produce in the quantities. It was supposed to produce it. And the orchard. The orchard was extraordinary. The apple trees along the eastern wall had bloomed first, as William had predicted, In a long and extravagant rush of white blossom that had arrived in April and lasted 3 weeks and made Alina, who had not expected to be moved by apple blossom, stand in the middle of it one morning and feel something so complete and uncomplicated that she hadn't known quite what to call it at the time. She knew now. That was happiness, the real kind, the kind that doesn't require an audience or depend on anyone else's assessment of whether you deserve it, the kind that is simply there, like the blossom, like the morning, like the clear cold stream running through the far edge of the property that was cold even in August. The old gnarled tree in the corner, the one that had looked, against all expectation, entirely worth saving, had produced more apples than any of them that autumn. Mrs. Holt had made 14 jars of preserves and was inordinately proud of this. Alina suspected she was right to be. Sophia came for a week in July, as she had come the previous July, and sat in the garden in the afternoons complaining pleasurably about London and eating an implausible quantity of Mrs. Holt's gingerbread. She brought news, as she always brought news, with the conscientious thoroughness of a woman who understands that information is its own form of kindness. Vivienne Marchand, formerly of London, formerly of Bristol, formerly of a great many places that had found her presence ultimately inconvenient, was in Paris. She had by all accounts landed on her feet, which was unsurprising. She was in the orbit of a wealthy French industrialist whose wife was, people said, beginning to notice certain things. Alina listened to this without satisfaction and without judgment, and thought briefly that she hoped the wife had good solicitors. Sir Edmund Price, the baronet in Derbyshire, had remarried, a sensible woman of 40 who managed her own money and had no romantic illusions to speak of, which seemed, Sophia reported, to suit him extremely well. He had recovered more of his financial situation than anyone had expected. He had also, apparently, written a monograph on agricultural drainage that had been well received in certain circles. People contained surprising depths, Alina thought, when given the chance to find them. Lady Drummond had turned 72 and showed no signs of becoming any less formidable. She had visited the school in May, examined everything with thorough attention, asked Miss Abbott several pointed questions, inspected the globe, and donated 40 books and a substantial sum of money with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who has too much and knows exactly where it should go. "She frightens me slightly," Miss Abbott had confided afterward. "She frightens everyone slightly," Alina had said. "It's how she maintains standards." Richard was better. This was Sophia's word, *better, and Alina had turned it over in her mind for a while, testing its accuracy, and decided it was precisely right. Not transformed, not redeemed in the dramatic sense that stories sometimes required. Simply better, which was harder than transformation and more durable. He had sold the London house and consolidated at Ashford Manor, where the reduced staff had turned out to be sufficient, and the household had the particular quality of a place being actually managed rather than merely maintained for appearances. He was working genuinely, consistently, with the attention of a man who had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was capable of it. He had written to Alina twice in the past year. Not to ask for anything, not to revisit what had been or propose what might be, simply to report, as one might report to someone whose good opinion one was working to earn through means other than charm, to say that the East Tenant cottages had been properly repaired, that the drainage scheme Mr. Cavendish had recommended was producing results, that he had joined the County Agricultural Committee and found it, unexpectedly, interesting. Alina had written back both times, briefly, warmly, without opening doors she had no intention of walking through. She wished him well. She meant it completely. William had asked her to marry him on a Wednesday morning in October, standing in the orchard in the precise spot where she had stood the previous April watching the blossom. He had asked her the way he did everything directly, without theater, in his own words, without performance. He had told her that he loved her in the specific and detailed way that meant he had been paying attention, not to the Duchess, not to the reputation, not to the story the Ton had made of her, but to her, to the way she listened, to the precision of her thinking, to the particular quality of her laughter and the way she moved through the orchard in the mornings, and the fact that she had once spent 45 minutes in genuinely heated discussion with Mr. Graves about the proper interpretation of a property boundary clause, and had been, in William's quiet assessment, entirely correct. He had said, "I know your situation is complicated and your independence is hard one, and I would never ask you to compromise it. I'm asking you to add to it if you'd like. I'm asking if you'd like a partner in the full sense of the word. Someone who will be on your side, not in front of you, not behind you, beside you." Eleanor had stood in the October orchard and looked at him for a long moment. She had thought about 19 and the walk down the aisle and the belief, genuine and complete, that she was the luckiest woman in England. She had thought about what luck actually was, whether it was circumstances or whether it was something else, something internal, a quality of attention and honesty and willingness to keep going when going was difficult. She had thought about the apple trees. "Yes," she had said, "I would like that very much." They had been married in December. Small, quiet, entirely themselves. The cottage and the orchard and the people who actually mattered, which turned out to be fewer than Eleanor had spent 11 years trying to impress, and more than she had feared in the darkest of those nights at Ashford Manor when the silence had felt like a verdict. Sophia had wept throughout and claimed afterward that she hadn't. Mr. Graves had attended with the expression of a man whose work was complete and who was satisfied with the results. Mrs. Holt had made a cake of such extraordinary quality that it was discussed in the village for months. On a Tuesday morning in late autumn, 2 years and a few weeks after she had walked out of the Pemberton ballroom with her chin raised and her hands perfectly steady, Eleanor Ashford Cavendish sat at her desk in the cottage study and looked out at the orchard. The trees were bare again, patient, ready. William was somewhere on the property doing something useful, as he always was. The school was closed for the morning, but Miss Abbott had left 3 essays on Eleanor's desk for her to read, written by the older girls on the subject of women they admired, and Eleanor was looking forward to them the way she looked forward to very few things, with uncomplicated anticipation, without performance, without any layer between herself and the pleasure of it. Mr. Graves had sent a letter yesterday about a potential expansion of the trust. She needed to think about it. Sophia was coming next week. The eastern apple tree, the one that bloomed first, had already shown the first faint suggestion of what would come in spring, a swelling at the tips of the branches that was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Eleanor knew to look for it. She picked up her pen. She thought for a moment about what she would say if someone asked her, how she would account for the past 2 years, what she would tell the girls in the school if they asked her someday how she had gotten from there to here. She thought she would say this: "I did not leave to punish him. I left because I had spent 11 years building a life around someone else's comfort and had nearly forgotten that I was allowed to have one of my own. I left to find out who I was without the performance, without the armor, without the role. It took time. It took work. It took apple trees and a good solicitor and a woman named Mrs. Holt who makes gingerbread that I am still convinced is supernatural. But I found her. And it turns out she was magnificent." She put down the pen. Outside, the valley was still and bright, the hills clear against a pale autumn sky. The stream ran cold at the far edge of the property. The school sat quiet in the morning light, waiting for Thursday. Beside the desk, on a small table, not in a drawer, not put away, was Richard's letter. The one she had kept, not as a wound, not as a reminder of damage done, but as evidence of something she believed in, that people could be honest when it cost them something, that understanding could arrive late and still count for something, that the world was large enough to hold both what had been broken and what had been built from the pieces. She had told the girls last Tuesday about a woman who had walked out of a ballroom in the middle of being humiliated and had not looked back. She had not told them who the woman was. She suspected, from the way three of them had looked at her, that they already knew. She picked up Miss Abbott's essays and began to read. The fire crackled. The apple trees waited. And a leaner Cavendish, who had once been a perfect Duchess and had become, through difficulty and clarity and considerable quantities of gingerbread, something very much better, was entirely, completely, magnificently home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.